The episode opens with Guinan introducing us to Worf's eventual beverage of choice, prune juice, which he immediately judges to be a warrior's drink. That's how he fits everything into his worldview, you know. Yes, this IKEA bookshelf is the furniture of honor. Are you sure about that? How can you doubt? Just look at it. What's that on it? My ceramic bell collection. A true warrior's hobby. Well, Worf is not long for this world, because there's a mysterious rift, and when a ship comes out of it, everything changes on the Enterprise and he's replaced with Tasha Yar. That's what time travel does. A ship comes out and suddenly Kirk looks like Chris Pine. This is the Enterprise C from 22 years in the past, fresh from a one-sided fight against the Romulans after trying to answer a distress call from a Klingon colony. In this reality, that colony was destroyed, and years later, the Klingons and the Federation went to war. That was the change. If the Enterprise C had been lost in a battle to defend the colony, even if they had failed just trying to do it, the Klingons' attitude would have changed and this war would have been averted. Dying in battle is something Klingons believe a great deal in, along with changing your makeup every couple of decades. Of course, the Enterprise crew don't know any of this, so they eventually decide to check it out and find only 2 surviving bridge officers on board, Captain Garrett and Lieutenant Castile. Garrett in particular is going to be an asset, since she not only proved capable enough to be given a command of an Enterprise, but being able to hold their own as well as they did in such a lopsided fight suggests that they would be very useful to the struggling Federation. And the ship itself might be salvageable, at least according to Geordi's anal probe. Guinan, however, is convinced that reality has changed and something needs to be done about that. She doesn't know anything specifically, it's impressions. But luckily, in either reality, she has Picard's ear, so she talks to him about it. Originally, they were supposed to learn of the changes because of data recovered from a probe, and while this almost Force-like ability to sense changes in reality can seem out of place, it does make this all the more of a Carrick-specific piece, because now there is a question of whether or not they can trust Guinan's instincts. She did appear in Theodore Rex, after all. Picard speaks with Garrett, who says they barely escaped with their lives, and Data confirms that, regardless of what they do, the Enterprise C going back is like trying to put on your high school jeans. It's a fight that will end in defeat. Picard finds it hard to justify what amounts to a death sentence, because while these people may be different, it hasn't twisted them into dark versions of themselves. They might be more hardened, less chummy, but they are still the people that they were. So Picard cannot condone letting people die a meaningless death. At least not when the Prime Directive isn't involved. Otherwise, go nuts. But he does trust Guinan a great deal, and let's remember that this Picard is a soldier. If he was told to take the Enterprise into the heart of Klingon space with a certainty of his own destruction, but the very real chance this war would end in victory by doing so, he would do it. And if in command, give the order himself. So that's his decision. I know it's a long shot, but I trust my bartender. During the first half of the episode, Tasha had only appeared on occasion to bond with Castile because the first part was establishing the new reality. The second was Picard struggling with the decision. It is only now that Tasha being alive is being drawn into the story, by first calling back, for the audience, to her real-world death in Skin of Evil, when Riker refers to the Enterprise C crew as dying a meaningless death. And then the question being raised of whether they're alive or dead in the proper reality. Eventually, Tasha confronts Guinan over the odd behavior, and Guinan finally admits she's not supposed to be here, which is exactly what was said about the Enterprise C, thus tying those 2 elements together. Tasha asks for a transfer then to the Enterprise C, and Picard at first denies it, but Tasha shares some words of wisdom. I'm not even supposed to be here today! And she could be a big help, because they lose Garrett's tactical abilities when a Klingon sneak attack gives her a case of death by console. We shouldn't have been surprised, though. In the original series, Gene set up a rule that strongly implied women couldn't be captains, but the rest of Star Trek seems to be saying, oh, they can, but we'll kill them whenever possible. Seriously, check the wikis for female captains and see how many of them either die or are introduced having already been killed. Hell, Janeway had her own show, and even she died so many times Jason Voorhees would be impressed. Picard tries to talk Tasha out of this, but choosing between non-existence because she died a meaningless death and going down in a fight that could save the Federation, well, she chooses the latter, and Picard is eventually convinced. Of course, they'll need to buy time for the repairs, and for the Enterprise C to escape. And of course, the Klingons will be arriving before that happens. Klingons may be fashionable, but they're never fashionably late. The battle begins with the Enterprise D needing to run interference, putting them at a crippling disadvantage. Remember that they're protecting an extremely slow-moving target against multiple attackers, which means that they are essentially helpless, having to sit there and take it in the hopes that the Klingons will be too busy killing them to attack the Enterprise C. It's an echo of what is to come / will have happened. This Enterprise must stand its ground and fight to the bitter end in order to save the day. Soon Riker dies, the bridge is on fire, and the ship is so damaged that now they can't move even if they wanted to. And meanwhile, Tasha Yar flies away safely. Her decision is looking better and better, isn't it? We see reality properly restored, though, meaning that they did it. The Enterprise C, with the help of Tasha Yar, managed to fight the good fight, and in so doing, avert the war. In Skin of Evil, Tasha proved that she had won the respect of one Klingon as a warrior. In yesterday's Enterprise, she proved she had won the respect of all Klingons. And for once, that respect doesn't mean getting kidnapped and forced to wed somebody. The thing about yesterday's Enterprise is that even though there are so many things to point to where we can say, here it went right, this is what worked, that's a point that provided cohesion amongst these other elements. Ultimately, this episode is not a machine that can be taken apart. It is an infinitely divisible piece, a sand painting, if you will, where everything flows together and complements. Dissecting it doesn't fully capture how everything went right when it could have so easily crumbled, especially when you factor in the sheer number of writers needed to try to finish the script, which is usually a bad sign. But instead, this episode is brilliant in its look, sound, and performance, from the deep character moments to the stunning special effects. It was far more than just Tasha's swan song. It did what Trek does at its best, to use the fantastic to explore who we are, and in this case, who we could have been, and still see that, even in a pessimistic world, there was still room for optimism. This story was the result of two separate ideas being fused, one about a past Enterprise coming to the present without changing the timeline, and Picard having to deal with the implications of sending it back to preserve recorded history. And another story that was made specifically to allow Tasha back, involving using the Guardian of Forever and having something go wrong so that the Vulcans become an aggressive Romulan-like expansionist power. Michael Piller suggested combining the two to get what we now have, and it's an episode that has a wonderful example of having your cake and eating it too. We all know that Star Trek, especially of this era, was never intended to glorify violence, but action and science fiction, especially when ships are involved, often go hand in hand. Now, you can get around that with the Siege of AR-558 approach of showing the horrors of war, which showed action as a grim necessity and war as senseless. But yesterday's Enterprise doesn't take that approach exactly. Instead, we are aware of this war. We are witnesses of how it has changed the familiar into this hardened place with hardened people. But the action itself that we see is not fatalistic, even though all of it is doomed to lead to death and defeat. Nor do we get a triumphant march to a glorious end either. The tone of this episode is everything. There is nobility, but not pride. There is grim resignation, but not despair. And there is stirring combat, but no gratuitous action. Yesterday's Enterprise walks a tightrope so fine you can't even tell that it's there. It seems to be walking on air and looking stylish every step of the way. And its time in the franchise was just right. It showed us our heroes facing inevitable defeat and the destruction of the Federation. But it was all just what could have been. We saw them face an end, but it was okay. Everything sorted itself out. Then later that season, it happened again with the Borg. But this time, there was no one saying that none of this should be happening. No one to say that we could just wipe this threat away. Yesterday's Enterprise showed us a bad dream that made it all the more terrifying when it showed up in the waking world. So, if I were to try to take this episode apart, as ill-advised as that is, here's what I would say makes it the success that it is. An emphasis on character, exactly the right amount of action to be exciting without going overboard, tying it into the mythology of the show without in any way being inaccessible, and a strong technical team for effects, set redressing, lighting, and even Dennis McCarthy delivering some worthwhile music. In short, yesterday's Enterprise did what TNG was best at. And successes like this allowed the series to seep into popular culture and ensure that, indeed, even our history will never forget the name Enterprise. Awards time. Planted Nostradamus. I count seeing alternate realities as being close enough. Dimensional Lazarus. Alternate realities and time paradoxes are a good way to replace your dead friends. Remember that if a party goes wrong. Writer Killing Spree. Writers who normally are forbidden to kill certain characters will always start just slaughtering them the moment that they know they can get away with it. And finally, Warrior's Drink. That's our show. Next time, Cisco finds out that it's a fake. I read that on the internet.